On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Jack Kora. He is the VP of Engineering at dscout. We're going to be talking about process and what to do and what not to do to remain nimble. Obviously, every company has to add processes, and that overhead impacts team velocity, that nimbleness that startups rely on. And I'm excited to have Jack come on and talk to us about that. Jack, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks, Amir. And a couple words about what the company does that I work for and kind of what my role is. So we are dscout. We are an online platform for user experience research. So unlike Qualtrics, which is really famous in the quantitative world and just focuses on basically surveys, we're video heavy. A lot of experience research focuses around having participants record a video. So if you need any sort of concept testing, more upstream research, we're a good one. My role at the company, so as a VP of engineering, we don't have a CTO, right? So I manage all of the engineering department. However, my role is a little more focused on the people side rather than just technology. We have a very sophisticated tech team and a chief architect who is a really, really solid engineer. And there's just really no need for me to be involved in tech other than at a very high level.
Awesome. All right. Well, I'm sure you probably deal with a lot of this stuff in one shape or form. And I guess every team has to deal with, growing and having to, enhance mature processes, and everyone's always trying to keep an eye out on team velocity and making sure that you don't add too much process, right? But you need some process. And I guess before we dive into that, give us a little lay of the land of how your teams work now, just to kind of understand.
Yep. So I've been at dscout for 4 years. Just so you understand kind of the journey we've been through. When I joined, we had 18 of people in my department. Right now, with some contractors, we have around 60. So we've definitely grown and had to grow our process. But at the moment, we're split into teams that are product-based teams. And they're cross-functional. So it's back-end, front-end, the QA, but also product manager and a product designer in each team. And each team kind of sets its own backlog and works towards its own product goals.
Awesome. I guess, you've been there now 4 years. Take us back and have us maybe understand how much process change has happened, right? So in the 4 years you've been there, and again, this is a very unscientific measure possibly, but are we talking about in the last 4 years, have you seen a lot of shift? Is it a slower shift, or how has process changed over that time for you guys?
Definitely a lot of shift.
A lot of shift. Okay.
Some of it was around just going from basically one big team to many teams. Another big shift was naturally, when we're on the smaller side, everyone did the same thing. At this point, we have, I can't remember, 7 or 8 teams. And each team does its own flavor of agile. I don't believe in standardizing the process across all teams. But then there was also a bit of a qualitative shift in terms of how we approach at its core. Do we always start with requirements first, then design, and then implementation, and then testing? Or there's more agile, for the lack of a better term, way to kind of be a little more iterative than that. And I'm happy to deep dive into that kind of later on in the podcast. But that was a shift we went through this year.
Got it. I guess as you go back and you mentioned a lot of change, a lot of shift, each team has its own version of Agile. I also was, kind of hearing that there are certain processes that seem kind of cohesive, or maybe each one, each team has its own specific way of doing it. But how is that handled? I guess each team can have its own ceremonies or rituals or how they'd like to implement Agile, obviously. But is the core different in each team, or do you guys actually, have some kind of standardization of what it should look like?
Well, looking sort of at my almost personal journey through Agile, which my first team moved to Scrum in 2008. So it's been a while that I've been doing this. And my personal understanding of Agile evolved to where right now, I don't care about Scrum, Kanban, or Scrumban, or XP. To me, it's a toolbox of different techniques, like stands, daily stands is a technique. Grooming meetings is a technique. I think groomings were popularized by Scrum, but doesn't mean if you're doing Kanban, you can do groomings, right? Or refinements is like it's commonly referred to nowadays. So to me, it's less about what you call the process and more about you need to do refinements. Well, do refinements. Do you feel like you need to meet daily for stand? Sure. But some of our teams meet like twice a week in person and the other 3 days are in Slack. So in that sense, yeah, everyone does refinements because how else would you do it? Everyone does stands at a slightly different frequency because there's definitely some standard techniques that are just so useful that everyone's doing it. But there's no like mandate from me or anyone else that you have to do certain things.
Interesting. I guess before we dive back into some of the signals of when process had to change, I guess keeping it current. When your teams have to work with each other, obviously, it sounds like everyone will do refinement, whatever you call it. You can call it, maybe it's Kanban, whether it's Scrum, that's all okay. When you have two different teams that potentially have to work with each other, how is it decided? People are doing slightly different things. How does that interaction work?
No, that's a good question. But so a year ago, roughly read this book called Working Backwards by one of like Amazon's SVPs who was there from the beginning. And one of the very interesting points he had there is as they scaled, first they tried to improve how they work in like inter-team communication. But what they realized is it's best if you don't have to talk to each other because you're independent. So a lot of our teams work fairly independently. Like there will be, of course, a couple projects per year where it's like a big enough project that spans multiple teams. In that case, that's a one-off, right? So we don't optimize for that per se. In that case, it's usually the work is kind of split into larger chunks and then each team executes independently. Now, one process so as you can probably tell by now, I'm pretty loose around what the teams do. But there is one process where I am involved and that I ask all the teams to do, and it's project management, which sits on top of their daily or weekly agile. And that's a more coarse-grained process, usually only needed for bigger projects, like over a month long, where there are milestones, deliverables, risk analysis. And if it's a cross-team project, then there will be milestones across teams. And that's where I'm a little more involved, and our like managers and directors pay more attention at like higher level.
Out of curiosity, where's when you mentioned project management, where do you keep all of that? How do you guys manage the repository?
Well, until literally like a month ago, it was Confluence. Just moved into Notion, which I would highly recommend.
Okay. All right. Everyone seems to, I hear Notion being used more and more. So that's interesting. Let's go back now. I think it's always interesting is when you identify the need for the process to change, because there's a danger, as somebody, let's say, who is overseeing things that, you might overcorrect or overprescribe a process, and that's always that is a potential. But when you're sitting and you're looking at things, and when you guys first notice, hey, things have to change, we're growing fast as other drivers, is there a signal, obviously, that you're seeing that's kind of black and white? Are there shades of gray of, hey guys, I think we might need to make some changes around here? How does that come about?
I would say there's like two driving factors. One is a team or a few teams are under delivering. And that could mean literally they're just missing dates. This could mean they're delivering on time, but say poor quality, right? That's also important. That's obviously a telltale sign there's something off. Doesn't necessarily mean it's a process problem, but it means that you, as a manager, you have to dive in and kind of figure it out, or help the team figure it out. I would say another criteria is if you feel like things are working well, but maybe they could be better. And maybe to qualify this last point, my core belief is that, right, process is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. And like earlier on in my career, I was like very enamored with process. And I don't know if I went too far into that, but it's easy to get carried away with, because it's cool. It's like engineering, thinking, but really it's there to help you deliver. So whatever minimal way of delivering works, if it works, you don't need more. But where I'm going with this is that different projects may need different process. For example, like I mentioned, the big change we went through this year, and I don't know if there's a formal name for this process, but I'm calling it Lean Startup after the Lean Startup book. And so, for example, we have some projects that are pretty well understood from product perspective. We have requirements, we have design that's pretty locked in. And so it's a little more waterfall-y, actually good for Scrum, right? You have PMs give you requirements, designers design, then you just go refine it and implement it. We're working on a really like major new product line where things are not as well defined up front, nor can they be. It's just too big of an undertaking to like really have like a waterfall process, right? And so we've adapted our process to, it's much more iterative. We're not building like the final product right away. We're calling it roughing in. Let's just rough in. It's bad UI. We're never going to go live with it, but it's enough for stakeholders and PMs to kind of see where it's going and adjust as we go. We've also run some, even with like roughed UI, we've run some end user tests like very early in the project, which actually we've learned stuff and pivoted the project. But if you look at it from the engineering process side, it's very different from your typical sort of project, right? Where it's almost a blasphemy to say, but like we're writing less tests because code's going to change 2 weeks later. We're allocating time towards the end of the project to go back and like solidify things. But that's a very different process than for a feature that's like well understood up front.
Interesting. I guess, you mentioned obviously there's two main drivers, missing delivery, which could have various factors or areas you can improve. I guess missing deliveries, that's obvious. That becomes obvious. Like you can see it, right? I mean, somebody's identifying, hey, the date slipped or the quality is looking poor. I mean, there's somebody that can identify. It's a little bit maybe more reactive because it's already happened. Areas to improve, as you kind of mentioned, you could tinker with it too much. Like you could overthink. I love the fact you said process is a means to an end. Keep it as simple as it needs to be to get it done. That little tinkering piece of coming up with, the process improvement, the minimal amount. You talked about the lean component to it. When you're looking to improve a process, that you're like, hey, I have sense that this is something we can work on, we can improve on. How's that process work for you? Is it a lot of collaboration with the team? Is it you kind of going off and thinking about some of the areas of opportunities and coming back to the team? How does that relationship or how does that coordination of that like improvement in process work?
Right. Overseeing multiple teams, I've tried to personally go in and get the teams excited. It's a funny story, but when I just started at dscout, I saw some potential for improvement, right? And as far as the scientific component of process, I like lean. And specifically, there's this leading lean software development book by Amir Bormand, which is, I think, really good. So I sort of organized a book club, tried to get people rallied up. Now, the book makes a lot of references to the Toyota way because that's where lean came from. And at some point, a couple of people asked me, why are we reading about car manufacturing? And for me, there was kind of a big moment of, as a VP, you can't personally sort of drive this. You got to find champions sort of on the ground, right? On the teams, people who will be interested and then will lead their smaller teams, which is what eventually happened. Now, people are actually using some of those lean techniques. Took a couple years, but there were a few champions who at some point were like, why are we all doing like this Scrum for like 3 years in a row? Like, let's experiment. And I think there is value in some experimentation. You don't want to do it needlessly too much, but just to stay nimble, right? Just to not get too static. Even just a different way to do retros, right? There's like a million. If you Google how to do retros, there's a million different like fun ways. Just rotating that, just to stay nimble and agile, and not get in your ways.
I really like that. Thank you for sharing that, because I think the one thing I was going to ask you to talk about, and you mentioned that, was when the executive wants to have too much influence over process, right? Especially if you're new and you're coming in from the outside, and you have a toolbox, a history of seeing things done other places. Obviously, depending on the size of the team has working dynamics. Tinkering with those working dynamics obviously will cause potential friction. You mentioned champions, which I think is a very good way of looking at it. And I guess as you kind of look back at your approach, and you obviously notice that champions are very important. I guess there's a danger of you could inadvertently slow the team down, right? Not only is it, obviously they're missing deliveries. You have problems. You got to fix those anyways. But in the case where you're trying to be proactive and improve a process, I guess when you're coming in, or even if it's existing team, you have a danger of slowing down your team, which obviously could have downward implications. And how much do you think about that? Is it important if the area improvement's big enough? Is it one of those where, hey, listen, it's an investment? I mean, how do you go about looking at that?
I mean, well, you touched on a good part of like new versus not new. I think when you're new, things are a little different. You have to build trust first before you can like really try to push ideas. At this point, though, where I've been here for a while, I don't really get involved in process other than just super high level. And even then, mostly what I discuss with the teams is the outcomes. Like, you have to deliver like within time constraints and with quality. How are you going to do that? I'm here to discuss, but I'm not going to tell you what to do. In fact, I frequently say, here's my thoughts based on my experience, but you decide, because it's your team, it's your project. You have to deliver. Where I focus on is encouraging experimentation, right? Encouraging free thinking and sort of continuous learning, which is part of agile. I also kind of frequently post articles in Slack. Hey, look, this is an interesting article. Take a look, to encourage that.
And that's interesting. I like that. I think that's a really forward way of thinking. As your own maturation as a leader, if you were to reflect back, how long did it take you, or what was the journey like to realize you're there to provide that oversight, to understand, but let the team, drive itself? Because obviously sometimes as managers, especially earlier stage managers, you want to jump in, be a part of the process. You want to, you still want to get your time into that area because that was where you're most comfortable, until you start realizing actually your role is a little bit different. How did that maturation come about for you?
Well, that's another fun story. And well, I mean, it's like, let's say you're a first-time manager. I think there is a lot of good reasons for you to still be involved. I'm speaking from like the point of view of when you're like VP or maybe director. I also want to qualify, right? In the past, not at this job, but in past jobs, I've sometimes inherited teams that were like in pretty bad shape. There, I had to, this wasn't the right time to be like, you guys decide. No, I had to step in and kind of be a little more authoritative and say, no, let's do this. At dscout, we have a great team, which is why I sort of have the luxury of not being involved. But my journey, I had an interesting journey, which is partly because I've had a lot of like bad teams in the past that I had to help kind of improve. And so when I joined dscout, I had a bit of that mindset, like, oh, I need to like improve things quickly, or need to kind of show off, my skills, and started pushing some of these ideas, like the car manufacturing book. And I gotta say, kind of subconsciously, I felt that the relationship with the team wasn't going well after I started. And we ran like an employee satisfaction survey, like a pretty classic standard HR survey, and it didn't have the best results for my department, which was the big aha moment. And then the company helped to get a executive coach for me. And that's where it kind of really clicked. The coach was very helpful. I'm sure you've heard the term servant leadership. But more generically, I love this. It's a really old Harvard Business Review article talking about styles of management. And it's like servant leader, and it's like authoritative leader. And there were 6 styles. And just like I was talking about the process and the right tools for the job, the same with management styles, right? You should have your default, and hopefully it's not authoritative, but there is a time and a place for every management style. So at dscout, as a company, our default is servant leadership, empowering our employees. But let's say if there's production incident, it's probably when you or maybe someone else needs to really step in and take charge, and not be like too much like, hey, what do you want to do? So again, with management styles, it's also important to recognize when's the right time to use what style.
Absolutely. No, I like that. That's actually a great way to look at it, because your toolbox has all these different options, and what you pull up and what tool you use at the time is probably as important as anything else, which is kind of that, it's management's more of an art than the science, because there is no prescriptive way of going, this is the right thing to do. It's this experience, like you said, different teams, different level of teams. I guess as you're kind of like looking back on this, and I'm always curious about lessons learned, and what you've taken away as you've kind of seen your experience in incorporating processes and watching the changes. Is there anything that you think you can share about some of the I wish I had done this differently in the past, and I do it differently now type of moments?
Well, this was the one where I joined dscout and started pushing for change kind of too quickly. Was definitely a huge learning moment where I realized, and it's a funny thing, because I've read about it a million times before, that you have to build trust before you like really start asking people to change things, but it didn't click, right? I guess I could say I didn't have it internalized until that story. So that was a big one, and in retrospect, the changes I was sort of pushing for were the right changes, and we're doing some of that now, actually. So it's not the changes I was pushing for, it's that I didn't build trust, and it's how I was pushing for them. So as a manager, obviously you need to be sure in what you're asking the team to do, that it's the right thing to do, but a very important part is how you're asking. Something more recent, I would say just more of like the same around being promoting curiosity, promoting experimentation is how you just keep your org at the cutting edge. Just not letting it get too static. Because then once you are static, it's hard to get going, right? If you're constantly doing little experiments, it's very easy to say, well, let's try this. It didn't work. It's okay. We'll go back.
I like that. That's a good one. I think you're right. I think that not only within team dynamics, but human beings in general, I think that curiosity factor is not easy to flip the switch on and off. So I think that's a very good one you're mentioning. Jack, I was going to say, man, like I could keep chatting with you. I appreciate your time. You've shared a ton. I love the examples. I can't thank you enough for being on. I like to ask every guest this question. I wanted to ask you as well as we're wrapping up here. If you could ask a future guest to cover a topic that you'd be interested in hearing more about, what would that be for you?
For me, this would be, how do you scale even further? So I manage around 60 people, right? But what if you're like at 200? I'm pretty sure it's different. Like what you do day to day is different, and what you focus on. So I would love to hear kind of what's the jump like the next order of magnitude.
Awesome. I like that one. I think, as you go through those milestones, it's one thing to learn on the fly, others to kind of have a sense of what's coming. So I like that one a lot. If someone wants to touch base with you on anything you mentioned on the podcast or anything in general, what's a good way of getting in touch with you?
I would say LinkedIn.
Okay.
If you're not a recruiter, which I tend to ignore, I think like all of us, I will respond. Especially, please mention the podcast. I will make sure to respond.
All right. So fair enough. Yeah. Obviously, we'll post the your LinkedIn handle in the show notes so everyone can find it easier. But obviously, we prefer it if someone reached out because of the podcast. Jack, again, thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing a super interesting topic, and I appreciate your time.
Yeah. Thanks, Amir.
All right. That's it for this episode. We'll be back again, different topic, different guest. Until then, two things. One, if you or someone you know can talk about, some of those challenges as you scale further, if you're further along within a startup, a mature startup, and you kind of go back and think about, hey, those days of being at 50, at 250, at 500, how those days changed as a manager and your responsibilities. I think that'd be great to cover. I think a lot of people going through that growth would love to hear about that. So reach out, let me know. I'd love to have you on. Secondly, if you found the podcast useful, share it with somebody else. That's how the podcast has grown. We don't do a ton of social around it. We like the organic growth. Give it a review wherever you listen to it. That's the thing that I know they love the most, to keep promoting the podcast. But other than that, that's it. Back again. Thank you and goodbye.